On this episode of the Peopleverse podcast, I am joined by Dena Prastos. Dena is the founder and CEO of Indigo River, and she is the first waterfront architect, trailblazing a new category in the industry. Indigo River is a women-owned transdisciplinary design firm focused on progressive waterfront architecture, resiliency, and climate adaptation. A leading authority in the New York Harbor and beyond, the firm specializes in climate adaptation through waterfront solutions that seamlessly transcends boundaries, guiding and executing projects from ideation through final construction and operations. So, waterfront architect, civil engineer, futurist, climate adaptation expert, entrepreneur, and creative original, Dena is driven to transform the built world at the water's edge. And I'm so excited to talk to you today, Dena. Thanks for joining me.
Evan, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to make sure I got that last part in there because it kind of touches all of these things together that make you and what you're doing unique. So if you could kind of take us through how you got to this place, and there's a lot there. I expect this to take a little bit of time, but that is what I think makes this such an interesting story. So jump off wherever you want to begin and kind of give us your origin story.
Sure, thank you. So I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and I, from a young age, loved using my imagination. And I think if you would have told me then that you can have a career and people will pay you to use your imagination, you would have hooked me then. But lo and behold, that is largely what architecture is using your imagination, envisioning for clients for the future. So I, in the traditional sense, went into architecture, went into a 5-year undergrad program, finished it, and went into civil engineering to gain a more technical understanding. And when I finished civil engineering, I wanted an even more, let's say, practical understanding of how things are built, not just, running through calcs on a sheet of paper, but the real assembly of how parts go together, what the contractors are saying. So I went into the field and I worked for a self-performed contractor for the first 6 years of my career. And that really gave me a launching point to appreciate the built environment and truly the sequencing and logistics involved in building and assembling. It happens that first project was a waterfront project. That wasn't necessarily something I was looking for, but it was a design build ferry terminal. And so I did get a lot of exposure early on into waterfront. And at that point, it was through the lens of a contractor and on the design build, the contracting, the building side of the design build contract. And when I finished there, I was looking to get more design expertise. So I leaned into my civil background and actually joined a marine team and got even more waterfront exposure there. And still, when I was getting the marine experience, I wasn't necessarily looking to become licensed in architecture, but I knew that I had the option. So I kind of came full circle and did get licensed. And the thing that I think kept me drawn to the waterfront, especially being born and raised in Alaska, was that immersion in nature. And so having grown up with, stream in my backyard, able to fish, camp, hike, at any point, 15 minutes out of town was desolate wilderness. In the city, I lived in Newark for a period of time. I'm based in New York City now. You don't get that connection to nature as easily. But when you're on an island like Manhattan, any edge that you go to, that interface with water, that's nature. So it makes sense now looking back that I gravitated and leaned into that as a specialty and certainly an appreciation for kind of a growing appreciation for work in climate adaptation space, understanding kind of what our impact is on the built environment, certainly on society, what a license means for an architect and really what we're licensed to do. And I feel like that is something within our society is not always recognized. Certainly, architects know that when you get licensed, you're licensed not necessarily to design or to draw or to, make pretty pictures. You're licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in the built environment. And that's something that I think gets lost a lot. So having come full circle now and looking at where we are and specializing within this realm of resiliency and climate adaptation, it really resonates deeply what that means to protect the health, safety, of the welfare of the public in the built environment, not only now and today, but largely working on a different scale of infrastructure projects, what that means over time.
It's so interesting to think of like how you've picked, and I don't know if it was picked for you. Maybe this is just how it's all worked out, but you've picked this very unique space to practice in, right, at the interface of the built environment and the water. And I can see all these dots kind of connecting, looking backwards at where you've come from and what you've gone through to get there. And then you weaved in this value of an architect into this. And I think what's so interesting is how I just gave a talk at AIA Kansas annual meeting about emerging or disruptive technologies in architecture and why people are doing a lot of the projects that they're doing on the technology side. And that really is around furthering the practice of architecture with all of these things coming at us: resiliency, climate change, equity, right? There's all of these pressures. There's social pressures, there's work site, there's labor pressure, there's 99% of the built environment is not done by architects, right? And so you kind of start to think about, like, you can start to see a clear path of why people are interested in automation and artificial intelligence and like because there's so much opportunity out there that is not being done by architects. But then bringing it back to what you said about protecting the health, safety, and welfare, and the disconnect between renderings and drawings and that, like the real meat of it, and where does the value of an architect lie? And I guess what it comes down to is we're not telling a very good story about the value of architects. And I think that you leapfrogged that, right? You're taking that head on because you're saying you're putting that at kind of the forefront, the leading edge of the story that you're telling people and why it's important, especially at the water's edge where you can point at something and say, look, the level used to be there, now it's there, right? Like that's a great way to just kind of start the conversation. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking about all that now that I just kind of spit all that out, right? Is because you really do go beyond this idea of, like you said, pretty pictures to thinking about these larger issues, how they tie into the built environment at the water's edge, and how you've kind of picked this special place to kind of weave this whole story together. Because what I want to be able to do is show architects a way to do what you've done, right? So launch into whatever kind of makes sense there for you to kind of jump off with. And let's talk about that, because there is an undervalue in society when it comes to this. And I think you're trying to prove that, or at least flip the table on that script so that it becomes more of the forefront of the conversation about the value of architects.
Sure. I think looking back at historically what the role of an architect was helps to understand how we got to where we are. And then I think looking forward at, well, now taking into account some of the themes that you mentioned with technology and climate change, what does that mean for our future as a profession? So looking back, the architect, looking at the Renaissance architect, master builder, really central to real estate development. And I think if you were to kind of separate out the different complementary professions that we have today and look at what an architect is left with, and what I mean by that is, and many in my complementary professions might not agree with this, but when you look at the architect protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public and what that means in the built environment, to me, that includes landscape architecture, planning, urban planning, environmental engineering, many different disciplines of engineering. Not saying that an architect needs to be specialized in all of those, but when we look at some of the different professions and how they've adapted over time, it's interesting to me that we still have one generalist architect. We have a prime architect, and they are responsible to know so much, and at the end of the day, they are contracted maybe 5% of a budget for a construction contract, but then end up carrying for eternity 95% of the liability on it. And we look at, design thinking and the digital world also, because to me, the digital world is also a built environment, and there is no one regulating that built environment. And that built environment, look at mental health crises, that built environment from social media affects mental health. That affects the public health. who's looking at that? So I think very much that instead of kind of looking at what was on the table for the architect historically and what's been carved out by planners, engineers, landscape architects, design thinkers, again, to me, that was all architecture. Even now, more recently, we have different, third-party systems that will certify you, and you're a licensed professional now or certified individual for LEED accreditation or resiliency or wellness. That's all architecture still. Absolutely, double down, get specialized, that's great. But the concern for the profession is others who are not licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare are dictating so much of our built environment, and it's not integrated into the purview of what an architect is contracted to do anymore. So there's a business model that doesn't make sense. Again, 5% of the fee, 95% of liability. That's just not sustainable. And we look at within the profession, for such creative individuals that we have within the profession, we haven't focused on recreating our role in society and staying current and adapting to what that means for the future. So I touched on a little bit about, the digital world being a built environment. There are, software architects. Well, are they architects? They're calling themselves architects. Much of what they do, the systems planning, the systems infrastructure, the software engineering and architecture, that is architecture. But we've not only lost the pie that we had, we're missing the whole kitchen on what's going on with the future and the metaverse. And there's so much opportunity, and I think there's room to course correct the profession and reassert the agency that we have as design professionals and as professionals that are licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. But implicit in protecting the welfare of the public is understanding our relationship with the planet and understanding if we're the profession that's responsible to that, we also have to protect our profession and adapt. And we're not doing that. We're kind of keeping the scraps that are left on the table and fighting them and undercutting each other. And it's, as a profession, we haven't stepped up to say, hey, wait a minute, there's so much more opportunity for us to have impact and meaningful change and drive our society and our culture in a direction that will better the future generations.
Yeah, I love the way that you think, Dena. This is awesome because you have this kind of long view. I can tell, right? Like you're thinking about these things as they. What I read an article earlier today. It was on Dezeen, and it was Thomas Heatherwick basically saying like our buildings are so boring. And he's talking about architects, right? He's talking about the boringness of architecture that is created, and we're creating 40-year buildings, not 1,000-year buildings. And so I'm starting to kind of connect some dots with things that I'm reading and being influenced by on the technology side. And I mean, it comes across probably a little self-serving for Heatherwick to say that, right? Because of his practice. But at the same time, like it's not untrue either, right? The commoditization of what architects do, everybody offers the same services and is trying to undercut everybody else, that right there is commoditization of the architect's value, right? We provide these services, we have these deliverables. Guess what? So does the firm that's right down the street, right? And so you're really, like you talked about, really competing at that level and not competing at where the value of architecture once was or could be. Like, again, there's just so much potential there. And what's interesting to me about what you're doing is you're kind of, I guess you're dialing in and getting really specific about the kind of architecture where you see being able to provide the most value, which I'm sure the specificity of that attracts the clients who want to build in those locations, right? Much more so than some architect on some street that does everything, like everything for everybody. And so I've worked in firms, I've seen firms that try to be everything to everyone, and you seem to be doing the opposite, and it's very specific. Can you just talk about why you chose to do that? I get like there's a background there, but why be so specific? Is it for these reasons or is it something else?
Largely mission-based, certainly, but also I think many architects identify with this idea of being different or distinguishing themselves in some way, and maybe a not a downfall. Certainly, I loved architecture school, and if I could be a student all my life, I absolutely would. Student of architecture, and I think studio was fantastic. but so much of the emphasis is on building new, and we don't always have that luxury. Much of what we need to do
Right.
now is adapt existing structures.
Yeah.
So there's that piece of it. And when I finished school, I thought, well, I can. It was around 2007, 2008. Economy turned, and I thought I can go, be bottom of the barrel, fight with everyone for a piece of, being a CAD jockey or whatever. But there are other people that do that, and they do it well, and I don't have a passion to do that. And so that kind of, for me, I wanted to differentiate myself by getting more technical understanding and kind of beef up my technical chops to be able to have more technical oriented conversation, because it wasn't a natural strength. So I kind of leaned into strengthening that area of mine. And the more I doubled down and focused on those areas that were kind of, outside of the normal purview of what an architect does, the more exciting the projects that I was working on. And it turns out that, human nature, you don't know something, you're a little bit scared of it. It can be intimidating, certainly. But as soon as you kind of cross that threshold of, it's intimidating for everyone the first time, but you kind of take that leap outside of the box, there's so much more potential to unlock, and you're not competing on the same things to the bottom of the barrel for refitting interiors or whatever it is. There's so much more opportunity to be creative and to work. I work with architecture firms all the time because I don't design traditional buildings. Have I passed tests that say I could? Absolutely. But would I feel confident doing it? Absolutely not. So kind of understanding that there is room for diversification within the profession. And I would advocate largely moving forward that the profession, the same way the medical community, the law community, the engineering communities, they've embraced different specialty tracks, whether it's through, board certifications. You wouldn't go to an ophthalmologist for a heart problem. Like, there are different specialties for a reason. They allow you to go deeper and still have, a general practitioner that can coordinate and connect the dots. Same thing in engineering. You wouldn't go to a mechanical engineer for a civil problem. Like, there are reasons that there are different tracks. Medicine, law, engineering, architecture hasn't done that. And I understand the importance of having a general understanding of everything, but there's still so much opportunity to specialize, especially as we move forward and have to work through, digitization and globalization. And there are things that, looking at regulation and how regulation changes, oftentimes, there might be a scenario that's unsafe. And so the course correction is to make a new standard, make a new code to enforce, and that's all additive. And the truth is, with digitization and with AI, a lot of the health and safety aspects of what architects do will become automated. And it's not far off. And so what does that mean? What's left for architects in the future if health and safety really becomes something that's, automated through digitization? How can we really focus on what that welfare piece means? And it is very similar. I read something just yesterday on social media. Someone, not an architect, was making a comment about, and I've used this argument myself as an architect, but just it's a very tangible example of how the built environment affects society and affects culture. And the comment was about putting baby changing stations not only in women's washrooms and family washrooms, but in men's washrooms as well, because it sends a message about whose responsibility it is. And so if we look at that, we look at stadiums that we go to that were built in the 50s based on a code from the 40s. Well, yeah, at that time it was appropriate. That was the norm, where there was a single family income, and primarily the woman was the homemaker and she took care of the children. And so on the outings, it made sense at that time. But we look at how it's perpetuated in today's society, where that's not necessarily the norm, and it's a direction that we've moved away from. But our architecture hasn't adapted. Our codes haven't been updated at the rate that they could be. And why is that? Well, we look at how codes get updated. Well, by and large, it's a lot of volunteering. Architects aren't getting paid to do that. They have the expertise to do it, but it's also a lot of adapting on the fly to understanding what the latest code is and absorbing it and implementing it in new work. So it makes sense why things are the way they are, but it kind of furthers my point of, as a profession, we need to be more creative about adapting for the betterment of not only our profession, but the public as well, and for the welfare of the public. And it's not for today's society, it's for tomorrow's society.
Yeah, there's the idea of the innovation curve. We talk a lot about this at Tech. We talk about this kind of innovators innovating on top of innovation. And so that curve is up and to the right, if I'm facing the right direction here. And so that curve is kind of accelerating, right? And then there's that adoption curve, which might be going up a little bit as people get more comfortable with technology, but it is nowhere near the rate of innovation. So the gap is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think what's interesting, you can point at technology and it's obvious, but the things that you're bringing up are less obvious, I think. And so I think they're more insightful because it's like the story behind the story, which is just another symptom in the profession of architecture that shows why I mean, if we can't keep up with all of that stuff too, right? There's the tech side, there's the codes, there's all of the environmental, there's a lot of things that are changing and we can't be aware of it all the time, right? And so I do think that there is room for automation to come in and help. And I think people are more fearful of it replacing than helping. And I don't think that it should be necessarily thought of in that way, because if you can think of artificial intelligence just as like the go-to example in this case, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an augmentation of people rather than a replacement for, that's a huge deal, but only if people decide to adopt that and get on board and exploit it for our use. I think there's so much fear there that we just stay away from it completely. And the ones who figure out how to exploit it for our use will just exponentially,
Yes.
leapfrog everybody else. I think one of the things that I'm really tracking closely is the use of artificial intelligence in creating artwork right now. You see these examples online by Midjourney and DALL-E 2 and Stable Diffusion, and it's incredible. It's inspirational. I mean, this is the kind of thing, the kind of architecture that actually, and it's not real architecture, it's images of architecture, right? But it won't be long until the next step comes along. But it is inspiring to look at. Why? Because it's fantastical. It's like it is inspiring to look at, and you can't deny that. And I think if architects got serious about adopting that rather than just thinking, holy crap, a machine can be creative too, we're screwed. Like, don't think of it that way. Like, how can you use this? Because if anybody can, quote unquote, create an image now, you don't have to be an artist anymore because of the augmentation of AI. It is still prompted by people to come up with these machinations of design. Architecture is not far behind this. It's going to be 3D. It is going to be buildings. And so the ones who have a great understanding of architecture and the process and what it actually takes to build something can use this for their benefit to take their practice to the next level. They're going to have to, right? Otherwise, I think the low level firms that do the drafting and do the things that are just rote, run of the mill kind of, those will go away, right? Those you won't need an architect necessarily to do that, because if you can systematize the codes and the HSW things that you're talking about as much as possible, I don't have to think about that stuff anymore as an architect. But that means the architects who only think about that stuff it's gonna go away.
Yeah, they'll become obsolete. So I recognize the fear within the industry about that specifically. I personally see it as a great opportunity because face it, there are parts of the profession that aren't the most glamorous. No one loves drafting, and whether it's by hand or on computer, there are parts that will become automated. And so what does that free us up to focus on then? What can we work on now? And I think the health and safety part of it will largely be regulated by code, because that's already, there's already plugins that are doing that, are catching things that are, need a finer tuning. And the opportunity comes then to focus on the parameters. What are we plugging in as the parameters? We can, rapid release thousands of options, but what are the parameters that we're grading them by, and how are we selecting what the final option is? Because certainly if we're kind of reglobalizing information and making available all of this, this digital library, which, face it, every firm has it. Every firm has, their standard ADA details for bathrooms and doorknobs, and why do we need to keep recreating that? I'm not saying there isn't value in detailing and having, thoughtful details at every single scale, but it's not always necessary when, as a profession, if we were to share that with each other and focus on larger issues, there's so much more opportunity for impact. I agree that it is an area that is feared. But personally, and looking to the future, if we're going to be scared of it and back ourselves into the corner, we're not going to be left with much on the table, and we will become obsolete as a profession. So it's really the opportunity to embrace it, and see it as an opportunity to affect change.
Yeah, leverage is a key word here, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
there's an opportunity as human beings who are experts at tool making and using tools to provide leverage to do something greater
Yeah.
than we could do
Yes.
without. This is can be looked at that way, or it could be looked at the other way. And so yeah, I think it's inspiring to kind of have this
Mm-hmm.
conversation out loud, and hopefully others will kind of join in and expand on the conversation after this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess where I want to go next is with the kinds of projects that you are doing at Indigo River. So tell us the kinds of things that you are really interested in working on and what you are working on.
One of the things I love about working on the waterfront is we get all different types of projects. And so that includes all different scales of projects and all different types of clients. So sometimes we are, the prime, and we'll work on a pier structure or a dock structure in a residential backyard. And that's one kind of interaction to have with a client. And it's really grounding to speak with people who don't have the nomenclature and jargon that's used on a business to business level within the industry, because other times we'll work on a much larger team like Eastside Coastal Resiliency, where we're a small piece of the team, but we are working on a very specific scope that has to do with, the barge sequencing, logistics support, material transport. And so there's a spectrum of types of projects that we work on and types of teaming partners and clients that we work on. So from the backyard pier structure or dock structure to a marina, to a port, to a bulkhead, to a quay, to a wharf. There are many different treatments, to a natural shoreline that needs to be restabilized. There's so many different types of treatments to our kind of edge condition of where land meets water, that for me is really exciting, because it's also a very dynamic moment to work in, where you literally have nature shifting and changing on you all the time with tidal cycles. So there's just this constant reminder of nature and its impacts and its forces, that isn't always recognized on a traditional landlocked site.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, that the specifics of that, I can imagine. There's just the expertise that you are able to offer to accelerate, or I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but I'm sure it definitely happens with those kinds of projects, is really about having the right people on the team, because I can only imagine the alternative and how painful that must be for an owner to work on a
Yeah.
project where I don't know, maybe they're deciding to tackle it themselves and be an owner builder or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and not have the expertise that your team brings to the table there. That's got to be so painful, and take so much longer, and trying to navigate all of there's so much there, right? There's
Yeah, so it's
regulation.
definitely the most heavily regulated environment that you'll come across, because it's there's so much habitat, and there's also, you're dealing with federal authorities, state authorities, local municipalities, and coordinating a lot throughout that process. And certainly there are technical expertise within it. We have coastal and marine and port engineers. We also have environmental engineers and planners, and kind of an array of different specialties that all overlap, but are overlap and are focused on the waterfront. But certainly sometimes the regulatory expertise can be kind of the low-hanging fruit of a differentiator, that there is a lot to navigate and to understand the different motivations behind the federal authorities, the state authorities, the different bodies that have jurisdiction over the same parcel. So it's, again, a dynamic place to work in, that does require expertise. And we're not, sometimes we don't get involved necessarily to do the design itself. We have the expertise, but sometimes we're involved to advise on, what the process is, or what the scheduling should be, or what the sequencing should be for, getting materials, or often logistical constraints, and different times of year that you can have in water work with the moratorium for the different habitats. So there's certainly different motivations and different skill sets that we use on every different project.
There's so many things that I would love to get into that we just don't have time for today. But I'm so interested in this kind of differentiator. You said the word, right? That's the word that comes up in every marketing or RFP response meeting, in every architecture firm, everywhere. And And I think a lot of times it's like, well, what makes us different? And it's like, against our competition, like nothing, right? Like everyone's qualified to do the project, but what is it that makes that firm the firm? And I think, it's funny because you think about all these kind of top lists of top firms in across the country, and they've got like the top 300 and the top 50. I'm interested, like, to me, it sounds like what you've figured out, the formula for, obviously backed with the performance that you've done, is being a top 5, a top 3 in that area. Like, and that's where firms should be shooting for, not a top 300, not a top 50. And not everybody is going to go for the waterfront category. You chose that one because of many reasons, but did you really notice a shift in business? I mean, has Indigo River, I guess I should start with, always been just this, as specific as you're making it with waterfront, or did it start out as something else and shift into this? And if it did, what was the difference when you did that shift?
So certainly we launched with a focus on waterfront, and that was a very concerted and deliberate effort to keep our strength and keep that as a differentiator, that we focus on the waterfront, and it can be, from project inception through concept, schematic, regulatory permitting, design development, all the way through construction drawings, all the way through, advising the contractor on the in-water work windows and sequencing, staging. And I think that also comes from having a background that is versatile, and that I didn't always only work for a design firm. I worked for a contractor. I've represented clients and municipalities, been on the owner's rep side as well as the design team. So I think with that kind of versatile background, but very focused geographical typology of the waterfront, it's created many opportunities, but kept us focused. So the other thing I'll say about kind of what we set out to do and kind of how we've evolved, which we're, launched in 2018, it's 2022, we're in our 5th year. One thing that we've embraced greatly, and it was more of a, I'll say, semantics, because you talk to any marine or coastal engineer and they're talking about sea level rise on a daily basis. They're talking about design life. It's not new to consider the natural forces, but the more recent kind of media spotlight on and political spotlight on what it means to have resilient infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, to focus on climate adaptation. Those are more recent trends, not that they're new concepts, but more recent trends to focus on. And so that was something that early on we had the opportunity to work on. We worked on a shoreline, and it kind of evolved into focusing on the flood mitigation strategies for the upland building as well. And it kind of opened the door to, well, a lot of buildings are adapting for flood mitigation, or need to adapt for flood mitigation concerns. And that was something that we've grown into and embraced at different scales also. So not only on a one site scale, but on, regional scale as well, because that's the thing about infrastructure, is you can't just look to improve one isolated area, or you can, but it's not going to have the same impact as if you look at it as a zone or as a region. There's a much greater impact at that level when you're considering infrastructure.
Let's take a short break from the interview to tell you about what we're creating for the building industry at TECT. And that is something we call the shortest path from keywords to contact. Why? Because architects are either specifying the same products over and over again on projects, or spending countless hours searching what I call the black hole of Google, because it wasn't made for us, the building industry. And if you're thinking, this is probably just some other product directory, it's not. This is a platform where people find people. TECT provides design professionals with direct access to building product experts, the people behind the products. It's where they can get the help they need from real people with real answers on their terms. Architects like me want an easier way to find expert help, save time, and ultimately get design intent realized without getting on mailing lists and getting inundated with cold calls. If you like what we're doing here on the Peopleverse podcast, I know that you'll find value on TECT as well. I believe in it so much that I left working at a firm to help the entire profession here. So do me a favor and go to tech.com to learn more and add your name to the list to join our upcoming launch by clicking one of the orange buttons on the page. Again, that's tech.com, and just look for an orange button to join the launch. We're building the platform where people come first. Thank you for listening. Now let's get back to the interview. Can we get into the nuts and bolts a little bit about a project here? I'm just interested in what makes these projects different from an architectural, maybe a component, maybe a systems level. Like, tell me something about that would get somebody interested in what makes this specificity of project type different than something else.
So I think part of it, there's the versatility of the different types of projects that you'll get, that I've named a couple different types. But there's also the versatility of even a day-to-day, what you do, where you go. So a large part of my days and weeks are in offices, but I also am on the water a lot. So most of our sites are on the water. And so that can come by, traveling by boat or bringing a kayak or stand-up paddle to go and inspect and get under structures and look at them. We have a professional engineer diver on our team that'll go down and inspect under the water and record and, bring up footage that we can analyze. And we have kind of some, as glamorous as there are, upland projects that you see the entire structure, there are also projects that are largely submerged and you don't see what's going on. So there's that kind of, peeling back what's going on underneath the surface, quite literally, of a project. But then there's also the early broad strokes decisions of, you have rights to construct on the water, and understanding what the parameters are and what can be manipulated and how it can be manipulated. Again, I'll talk about the kind of the different motivations from the regulatory authorities of, how much shading do you have? How much volume of fill are you installing? What as of right do you have to build back? What is grandfathered in? So there's kind of this, forensic due diligence analysis that goes on with every project of what was there historically? What was it used for? What does the sediment transport look like? How is the coastline naturally evolving and changing? Or is it a working waterfront? And what did that workforce look like? And how did they use the structure? So there's a lot of kind of forensics that you can go down the rabbit hole, which for me is exciting and appealing. But then there's also, this grand visioning of whatever gets built. Largely, one of the most motivations for building on the water is there's a water dependent use. So there's some connectivity to the water. And whether it's the backyard pier that, a homeowner wants to be able to access the water and launch a boat or a kayak or access their, larger vessel, to a larger project like the Harlem River Greenway, which is connecting the last bit around Manhattan, so that you can walk or cycle around the entire island. You weren't able to do that before. So we're working on, it's a bulkhead project, but there are a couple hundred segments of different types of historical structure that we're looking to fix. And we're a team member on a larger team, but our scope specifically looks at what are these different typologies? What were the construction methods then? What was their impact then? What are we proposing with the design engineer of record, and what are those construction impacts? What will they be? And what is the net result? Are we filling the water? Are we encroaching into the navigational channel? Is it justifiable? So we look at a lot of different, again, competing motivations, sometimes complementary motivations, but there's certainly the ecological aspects of it as well, that if you're interested in, biomimicry or ecology and habitat restoration or creation, there's so much opportunity on the waterfront, marshlands and wetlands. And so for me, having a background in, being immersed in nature, appreciating nature so deeply, this is an opportunity to add, a human, man-made, man-designed element to something that really becomes one with nature, whether or not, deliberate.
And allows people to experience that at a much deeper level, potentially, than has been thought of in those locations than ever before, right? So that's incredible. I'm sure that's so satisfying for you to see people having those kinds of experiences that you grew up having and are bringing to the urban environment, or at least the interface of the urban to the natural environment. That's so incredible. So my next question is really around, because you're doing I know that there's probably a range of project types that are on the waterfront. Just give us an idea of what what you're mostly, or what are the different project types that you're touching? You've mentioned like these interfaces, the bulkheads, but is it mostly residential? Is there commercial? Where does that fall?
Largely commercial. So we work, I'll say, primarily in New York Harbor, have worked elsewhere as well, but the most of the Manhattan shoreline, specifically, it's very little of it is privately owned. It's
Okay.
largely owned and I'll say operated by the city. New York EDC operates much of what is controlled from SBS on the water, and or it's a park like Hudson River Park Trust or Battery Park City Authority. So we work with municipalities and we work with the different authorities who are stewarding the land. And sometimes it is a park structure, and sometimes
Hmm.
it is a maritime use. So it could be a port facility or a transfer lift or a different ferry terminal or a ferry landing, port facility. Right now, what we're emerging into largely in New York Harbor is offshore wind. So we do have some port facilities that are looking specifically to be within the pipeline of as the offshore wind structures are being assembled and kind of coming down the Hudson River through New York Harbor and out offshore. We need the upland infrastructure. We need the supply chain to quite literally come down the river and be assembled and taken out and put up into place offshore. So a lot of the port facilities are undergoing transformations to be able to accommodate those changes. Um,
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. So much logistics. I've talked to other people in the prefab community, and like the problem often starts with logistics rather than ending with logistics, right? Because
mhm.
if they can't get it there, they can't do the project, right? So it's kind of starting at the with the end in mind. It sounds like there's a lot of that involved here too, because there's so much logistics, both land and water, that have to meet at exactly the right times in exactly the right sequence for this stuff to happen. It's incredible amount of orchestration going on.
Yeah, and I think one of the more exciting opportunities I remember learning in school about, building in Manhattan specifically and what some of the constraints are and how everything really needs to come in by tunnel or by bridge, and what the segments of steel, how big they can be to have the turning radius within the city, and how much opportunity there is to transport by water and open up and kind of break free of some of those
Oh, I
restrictions or
bet.
preconceived constraints. So it's always super exciting to work on a project where we can look at prefabricating different elements and bringing them in by water and setting them, especially if it's a waterfront site, and
Hmm.
just setting them by water and completely eliminate so many trucks on the road and so much congestion that's generated on the roads in a dense urban environment.
Maybe share a story about an interesting problem that was solved through collaboration. I mean, one of the things that what you're talking about, there's so many moving parts, there's so many people involved. A few times now you've said you're a small part of a large team. I bet you've seen a lot of wild stuff, but is there anything that comes to mind recently, maybe, that was just a really interesting problem that you saw solved through working together, collaborating on a project to make it actually happen?
So maybe not recent, but one of the more memorable kind of moments in my career, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers overseas in the Middle East for a year. And I remember before I went asking kind of what to expect with regard to being a woman in a male dominated industry here, but now in the Middle East where I didn't know what to expect for, a woman in the industry, period. So I was on a site, and early on it was a construction project and I was a quality control manager, and early on we were we had staging zones for material in the laydown yard, and something got offloaded. Doesn't matter what happened, but the response when I asked for it to be corrected or inquired as to why it what was going on, was that in this case the individual wouldn't take orders from a woman. And that just wasn't something that I
Wow.
was accustomed to growing up in America. And it was eye opening, and I could appreciate on the one hand that I wasn't there to change a culture, but I was there to get a job done. So it really reinforced the sense of team with my counterparts that had also come from the United States that kind of stepped up and similarly weren't trying to change a culture but wanted to get the job done. And so it really, again, it enforced the sense of team that no one can really do anything alone, that it's your reflection of the people you surround yourself with and the people that you collaborate with. So very early on, having an appreciation for whether ill-conceived or malicious intent aside, being able to collaborate and kind of work through hurdles, just or unjust.
That I did not see that story coming. Okay. That was great. I think I cannot imagine what that situation would be like. And I know I've had another guest on the show early on in the podcast's inception, Charisse Lakeside, who also talked about, she's a senior specifications writer in a very male dominated part of the industry for sure in specifications, and talking about kind of not, I won't even say similar, but there was some similarities between the story you just told and some that she told. And these are definitely the stories that I think are worth talking about in the industry for sure. So I appreciate you bringing that one to the forefront. What is your favorite part of what you do?
Honestly, the people that I work with. I do love having kind of a lasting impact and understanding what our decisions today are doing for future generations. But day to day, the people that I work with, and that's internally and externally. I founded Indigo River because I was looking for something that I could not find. Not to say that there aren't great firms out there, but just logistics of where I live and where I work and what kind of lifestyle I wanted to have. I could not find the right balance, and so I knew there was certainly tremendous opportunity within this specialization, and I surrounded myself with good partners and good employees early on, that we were able to create an environment where we do have fun. We love what we do. We have fun, and we feel like we are creating a lasting impact. And it is very much centered around this mission to leave the next generation better than what we inherited. And that's kind of a philosophy that I think we get all too caught up being dutiful descendants instead of good ancestors. And so that's something that if we can leave the world better and stop trying to please predecessors, but rather create greater opportunity for the future, that's why we're here. And that goes to kind of a larger philosophy on what, I think oftentimes we get kind of laser vision or tunnel vision into, creating resilient infrastructure, creating sustainable environments. And it's a low target in the grand scheme of things. Like, what does it mean to be sustainable? We're able to maintain life. Right. Like that's a really low bar. So right. When looking at the bigger picture and looking at a longer timeline, I think the goal really should be kind of independence from linear resources and deglobalizing the physical resources. We look at energy. There's so much opportunity to have regeneration rather than this linear resource and waste model that we currently use. And again, to set the goal as sustainable, it's low.
Yeah, it's a hard term to get away from, though, right? Because I totally get what you're saying. And I've worked with people in sustainability specialties that have had very similar sentiment. Like, that's sustainable isn't good enough because of the true definition of the word. Like, all we're trying to do is make the finite resources last a little longer, right? Yeah. And so there's still kind of this downward trend as regard the quantity of said resources and our ability to use them as resourcefully as possible, but only, again, for a certain amount of time until they're gone. So the idea of renewable is that at least putting things back into the coffers as we go along, or regenerative is another word that I think makes sense. But I also appreciate your point of view on not pleasing kind of not working so hard to please the previous, but working toward creating a future that really matters. And you say the favorite part of the process is the people. This is the right show for you to be on, right? The whole idea of the Peopleverse is creating those people-based networks, because that's where the wisdom really is. And that's where the magic of these ideas and like that really forward thinking come together. You bring the right people to the table early on in the projects, and things can go so much better because the earliest decisions have the most impact, period, right? Whether those are good decisions or bad decisions, they do have the most impact. And so we're really encouraging design professionals to work with the supply side as early as possible, which I can imagine in waterfront is probably even more important because there's so many other constraints on the built environment in that kind of a situation. So is there anything that advice that you have maybe in that more narrow piece of the of this overall framing regarding working with supply side in waterfront stuff that you've found to be good experiences, bad experiences? I'm just looking to kind of illuminate the situation because you're doing a way more specific kind of project than I think most architects do. What is it? What can you share as far as working with and finding or the helpfulness or non-helpfulness of building product manufacturers when it comes to the kind of work that you are focused on?
So there are some, tried and true methods of building on the waterfront. It's not new. There have been societies living on and with the water harmoniously for a long time. But I think we are at a more exciting moment where there are some newer technologies enabling, 3D printing of structures that are conducive to habitat generation. There are different types of concrete that we've been able to identify that don't have the same emissions, that have, greater potential to sustain and to create habitat. It's a small place to work at the end of the day when you're in the harbor because you know a lot of what's been going on, and you also know kind of the latest and greatest of what's emerging. So it's you're able to kind of stay focused and keep a tight network of emerging technologies, emerging trends, have the conversations. We've been very fortunate in that many of the vendors that have cutting edge technologies, they want to be at the table in the early decisions, the early discussions of what are the goals of the project, what are the objectives, what are the opportunities, and really tailoring their solutions to meet the demands of the project or meet the needs of the client or the needs of the environment, whatever it is.
Again, I just to reinforce, like I can only imagine the I mean, I'm not going to say that there's maybe more constraints, but maybe there are more constraints on your kinds of projects, and having that early seat at the table to bring together the right people at the right time has got to just be make a huge impact on the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, and it certainly, I think one of the things that helps most is that that background, and I think this applies across the board, but that background having sat on the contractor side, having sat on the owner's rep side, having sat on the design side, that it's very easy to pick up the phone, and if I don't have the expertise, I can call a contractor and say, how would you build this, or what, have you used a product that was successful, or have the conversations, and it does come down to the people that and the network that you have to be able to engage in those conversations early on and do so confidently.
Okay, final two questions. First one is, what are some compelling reasons why someone should consider becoming what you are? Which is, I'll say an architect, but you are way more than an architect. So there's this idea that obviously underpins this whole conversation, which is your upbringing, your deliberate or maybe non-deliberate path of like sampling these different pieces of the building industry to get where you are today. Maybe you could speak toward that side of things of getting all of this experience where it culminates into where you are today versus this kind of specialized track in a very specific thing that a lot of architects choose to do as well. Like make a compelling argument of why this kind of broader generalization to understand the bigger picture is the path. Let's just assume it's the right path to follow.
So as a person who appreciates nature and appreciates design and appreciates the interface of the two, for me, working on the waterfront and asserting my agency to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in the built environment, it's not limited to a detail or a line on a page. It really is more engaging and versatile experience that I am able to, invest my time in. I'm not going to say even spend my time because I see it as something that I'm investing in, that I enjoy what I do. I enjoy the output. And it's, again, for someone who appreciates nature, I'm immersing myself in nature the best way I can in an urban environment. So for me, it's very satisfying, and I appreciate it. I also appreciate kind of the larger picture of what we have agency to do. And I think there's so many different paths for architects, and there's so many paths that are not yet explored, and that we can certainly push the boundaries for the profession, and would implore any young architect or any architect period to begin to do that, to find other ways to assert your agency to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, because it's not limited to a building. It's not limited to a 3D model. It's not limited to a picture. There are so many more ways that we can affect change and welfare of the public now and in the future. So whatever means kind of speak to your values, to be able to explore those and exercise them on a routine basis.
Love the way you answer that question. And I think that you said it earlier on in the conversation, kind of thinking about social media, the digitization, all of these things feed into the health, safety, and welfare of the communities that we serve. And even going back to that article that Heatherwick was involved in with thinking about buildings being 1,000 years versus 40 years, there's a much different kind of thinking that goes into a building that is serving a community, the public, whoever the users or people who own that building are, for a longer period of time, with that kind of thinking behind it, just in the way that they adapt to and react to space, and how it makes them feel, and how it then enables them to contribute in different ways back to their community. Like housing is a great example of this. If you have really crappy housing, then there's this general attitude and mentality and mental health that then, because of those spaces, works its way back into society in lots of different kind of unseen ways, right? So again, I love the framing that you come to this with, and kind of really thinking about this in a much bigger way. And there are so many places that architects can get involved. And so I hope this episode's kind of illuminating for the supply side as well, to really understand what architects are or could be dealing with if they choose to, because there is so many larger implications here. And I mean, here you're a great example of somebody who's doing just that. Final question. I said there was two more. This is the last one. If you were handed a megaphone and could blast one message to the building industry, maybe it's a billboard. You're in New York City. I've had other guests on from New York. I said, like, well, what if we put something up in Times Square, like that was a message just for the building industry? What would you say?
So I think this probably transcends beyond just the building industry, but certainly to the building industry as well. We can afford to be much more stoic in our philosophies. And if we can continue to ask ourselves what is necessary at every moment, is this necessary or is it excessive? Because we live in a world where we have so many things on demand, and are they really necessary? What is truly necessary? The environment, it's an everyday issue. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's the food we eat, it's the things that we can't live without. And so if we can refocus and prioritize those things and declutter or kind of remove ourselves from the noise of trends and fads, and understand really our time here is limited. Like in the 44.6 billion years of Earth, like if you scale that to 46 years, we've been here for our industrial revolution. We've been here for a minute, and we've destroyed 50% of the world's forests. Like, that's to understand our impact and to understand what we need, and what is actually necessary, and to maybe just kind of take a step back and detach ourselves from being selfish in the moment, and understand that this is an existential crisis, and we can see, and it's very hard to unsee. It's very hard to unknow kind of the trajectory that we're on. So if we can reframe and really ask ourselves at every moment, consider what is really necessary, and start there, I think we'll be a lot better off.
Yeah, there's this kind of idea of ignorance versus ignorance, right? Like ignorance is kind of a way to think about it that's more naive, and it's like, well, you can't be blamed for what you don't know because you don't know what you don't know. But then there is this idea of ignorance, right, which is more purposeful. And to ignore the very real threats, as you so well framed it, like we've been here for a minute and look at the destruction, right? And purposefully not choosing to deal with that when we are charged with the health, safety, and welfare of the public. I mean, that's a big deal. And so the whole kind of my underlying theme, that I'm really drawing from this is, you said it earlier, leave it better than you found it, right? And this goes back to the Nature Conservancy and the Access Fund and all, there's John Muir and there's all of these kind of ideas out there that come from the natural world and the national park system. And it's like, leave no trace, right? But this takes it to another level. Leave it better than you found it is a huge call to action. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate this conversation. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
I want to definitely make sure people can find you everywhere that you want to be found online. So I will have a link to your website and to you on social media. Where's the best place that people can get in touch if they want to learn more about you?
Email, Instagram, just LinkedIn. I'm present.
We'll have all of those links in the show notes for this episode. So Dena,
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Evan. Really appreciate it.
Hey, before you go, can you do one thing for me? Hit the like button. It really does help us in the YouTube universe. Watching all the way to the end is probably even more helpful, so thank you for that too. It all adds up and helps more people find the show. These are great ways for you to help spread the word and contribute to the Peopleverse. If you want to help the channel even more, please subscribe and use that red button right down there and turn on the notification bell so that you'll know exactly when the next episode comes out. It's completely free to do so. And finally, do you have something to add to this conversation? If you do, leave a comment. I read all of them. I can't wait to share the next conversation with you. So until then, see you soon.